Stephanie, you know that I went on a senior trip with the group that I teach English to, and it was really awesome. It was like a weekend trip. It was like a senior sleepover with a bunch of teachers, and they were all divided into groups. And I had some very interesting conversations. And it kind of ties into what we were planning to talk about today anyway. So I just want to give like a little brief synopsis of my conversation. So politics came up and I was kind of put on the spot with this whole, what's going on in the United States with Trump and Biden. And so I asked, like, well, what do you guys think about Trump? And there's this overall belief that the Russia collusion hoax was real. They are convinced that that's how Trump got elected in 2016 because of election interference from Putin. They see Trump as like the Putin of the West. They believe that he's power hungry and that he wants to take over the world. And that if Trump wins, Putin won't stop at Ukraine. And then he's going to try to conquer all the other European countries. And it was such an interesting view of Trump as this like, he's the equal of Putin, right? And they just both want to destroy the world.
Wait until they find out that you have this podcast.
I know. And so I asked, I'm like, well, how do you guys view Biden? And they said, well, it's very obvious that he has mental decline or dementia. I'm like, okay, so at least they see that, but they don't believe he's corrupt and Trump is like the real threat. And they were so shocked when I explained what's really going on in America. And like they couldn't believe it. And on one hand, I understand the perspective that they come from because this is a group of seniors that are all over 60, most of them in their 70s and 80s, and they all grew up under the influence of communism. And many of their families were jailed and persecuted by Stalin and even by Khrushchev under communist rule. And several of them like lost their homes because the government took them away, and the kids weren't allowed to go to school. And I have gotten to hear so many incredible stories over the past couple of months. One woman told me about how her father was put in prison for 10 years because he didn't want to join the Communist Party. And she was sent to live with other people. And then she was allowed to go to school, but her brother was not allowed to go to school. And another guy's wife had her entire family killed by the communists. Another guy had his farm and all of their livestock taken away by the government. And like, I noticed there was like 30 people on this trip. And I noticed they all shared similar professions. And it's because they weren't allowed to choose what they wanted to do. They were assigned by the government where you were going to go to school, what you were going to do for a job. And it's basically the government saw fit that you had no freedom of choice if you wanted to survive. So, and people couldn't practice religion, and anyone who did was persecuted. And like hearing these stories firsthand has been so incredible. And so, on one hand, I understand why they have this very vehement hatred towards anything that has to do with Russia. But they're also, no, are you
Well,
gonna say?
what I don't get though is like, do they realize that the left is the one that's like pro communism and pro socialism? And like the
No.
fact that Putin invaded under Biden, that he wouldn't dare under Trump. So like what you're saying, I'm like, do they just not know because there's propaganda, or are they just like ignorant to like what's really happening and just not paying attention?
Well, that's where I was going with this is they, I think, still live under the impression that America is like it was during the 1950s, like up through the 80s, right? And I had this very lengthy discussion with one of the groups about voting in America. And they truly believe that there's no election fraud, there's no election interference because we have the most democratic voting system in the whole world. And they could not understand how we allow people to vote by mail or to vote online, or how people could possibly vote without having ID and why we don't have requirements. And I was trying to explain it's not only that, but every state has their own voting procedures. And like, if you go online and you look up how you can vote in each state, it's totally different. I mean, it's overwhelming how ridiculous it is. And they were just in so much disbelief because their view of the United States is that we are just this, you know, savior country and the perfect country, and everything that we do in America is fair and equal. And they could not believe that we have problems like we do. And it was just such an eye-opening thing because, like you just pointed out, it's very clear the propaganda that's being portrayed in Europe about the United States. And it just like, as much as it blew their mind to hear what I had to say, it was so eye-opening for me to see these views and beliefs that they have because they're so opposite of what's really going on.
Well, at the same time, though, it's like pretty much their view seems very similar to what my view was prior to, maybe like 2020 or 2018. It's like,
Yeah.
I thought, we live in the greatest country in the world where everything is fair. And, I didn't realize all the corruption. Really, I didn't realize most of this corruption until we started doing the podcast. I mean, I saw some, um, but it's interesting. And I think for people of that age, when you're not on social media and like you're really only getting your news from the actual scripted news, like you don't, like, you haven't gone down the rabbit hole. You don't have any idea of what's really going on. So I could see that, but it's interesting the way others view us, especially like thinking that if Trump gets in, Putin's going to invade like the whole world, because we look at it as the opposite. Like, he wouldn't dare under Trump, and he didn't under Trump. So it's like so interesting to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, when I was away, I was really happy to see. So I went to a very, very wealthy area, Naples, Florida, where, I mean, literally billionaires. Like, we were looking up the prices of these homes on the beach. One of them was $239 million.
Wow.
Like, that is the level of wealth in this place. But I have to say, I was super excited to see there was a lot of Trump support everywhere. And like, when we were on the beach, there were like these mega mansions that had like this huge American flag, like hanging down. And that was good to see. I'm like, I'm glad, because sometimes you think like all these rich elites are all on the left, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case. But the last day we were there, like, I avoided politics the whole time, totally like had my head out of anything going on. And then the last day, of course, like, you can't go anywhere without hearing that Trump was found guilty on all 34 counts. And, it's funny because once I heard that, like, I went on, I saw like the usual accounts we follow and everything like that. And of course, everyone was really upset, but I'm like, I'm not surprised. I mean, this was the plan all along. Like, you're in New York. Obviously, they're going to find you guilty in New York. Um, and what did it do? He raised $54 million. And I would just like to point out the fact that when we, like, the people on the right, or not even the people on the right, just normal people, normal Americans, get an outcome that they don't like. Were there riots? No. Was there looting? No. Did we set anything on fire? No. What did happen? Everyone band together and raised $54 million for Trump's campaign.
I heard also that a good majority of that funding came from first-time Trump supporters. So it's
Yeah.
got to be people who were either like libertarian or prior or still Democrats, maybe, that just see what's going on and are finally waking up to the fact that it's wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I was surprised. So what I like to do to get like a good pulse of what's going on is look at the comments on social media. And one thing I've noticed for the longest time, if I'm on Instagram, there's a lot of like, different accounts that I follow, and the comments are always left leaning, always, always on Instagram. That changed after this verdict. There was this account, it's called Girls Think I'm Funny, and they post like memes and stuff, and they posted some meme about Trump that was kind of like anti-Trump. And I went to the comments. There were thousands and thousands of comments. Every single one of them was Trump 2024. This just proved that our justice system is broken. This proved corruption. Like it changed people's minds.
Yeah.
So that was really cool to see. And I was like, I think this is going to help him more than hurt him. But with that being said, um, something that is concerning is Don Jr., his son, was on Tucker, and he brought up a really alarming point, which was that the sentencing for Trump is 4 days before the Republican convention where they pick their candidate. And he's like, do you think that's just a coincidence? Of course not. That was planned. And so that was concerning because it's like, okay, well, if they sentence him, let's say they sentence him to prison and they take away his Secret Service, which they want to do now. Democrats are outright saying they want to take away his Secret Service, which Tucker and Don Jr. were saying that is the death penalty. They are trying to kill him or assassinate him by taking away his bodyguards. But if he is in prison or something, would that be a way for the Republican convention to then pick someone else? I don't know, but his daughter-in-law is like heading up the Republican convention, right? So I'm not too concerned, but I do think that that was purposeful 4 days before the convention that they're going to do that. Something else, though, that's positive that gave me hope was, again, on social media, I see there's like all these protests. I don't even want to say protests, like rallies in the UK, and they were for Trump. And people were chanting in the crowd, Trump, 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 Trump. And they were interviewing people, and these people that aren't even in our country were saying, like, we need Trump or the West is done. We are done for. And that was surprising because I haven't seen that yet from other countries and having that kind of a response. So,
I
like,
definitely have not seen that here. They seem to be
yeah.
very pro Biden here.
Yeah. So that was interesting. Um, but like the other thing that was kind of concerning that they sort of left off on was Tucker was, they were talking about everything happening in the world with like these wars breaking out under Biden. And Tucker was like, all of a sudden, we're hearing about a draft, a potential draft left and right. Everyone's talking about a draft. And I thought that Don Jr. would kind of blow that off, like, yeah, well, And he was like, well, let's just think about this for a second. In 2020, for that election, the distraction was COVID. And he's
Right.
like, for this election, the distraction could be World War III. Like, that is what we're looking at. And that freaked me out, especially as a parent of a teenager, where there's like a potential draft or whatever. So it was just a really interesting conversation. But I'm choosing to see that I really think this helps Trump more than anything. It helped him raise money. There's more people than ever supporting him. It's plain as day that the Department of Justice, our whole justice system is corrupt. And for anyone that still doesn't see it, they don't want to see it. They are actively ignoring it at this point, and they'll probably never change their mind. But I think there's a lot of common sense people that looked at this and thought, wow, you take something that could maybe possibly be a misdemeanor, maybe that's never been tried as a crime, and you turn that into 34 felonies
Mhm.
on the biggest presidential candidate.
And
That's corruption.
and they purposely changed the statute of limitations before this case to fuck Trump,
Yeah.
to make
Yep.
it a felony. I mean, it is just absolute insanity. But I think, I mean, I love your positive viewpoint. I think if Trump can keep his focus on America and Americans and not on himself and not make the comments that he does that rile people up and just pro America, pro America, pro America, I think he has a really good shot of getting the not MAGA people, but just the rational, common sense Americans who may still be on the fence that just want someone in there that can make good decisions.
I agree. And I don't know if you caught any of his speech at the Libertarian like convention or whatever they call it. Um, it was really interesting. So Dave Smith, who like I really like that guy, he got up on stage and he's been a critic of Trump like for a long time. He's a libertarian. And he said, he's like, look, before he comes out, I want everyone to think about something. There is one candidate that showed up tonight, and that's Trump. Biden's nowhere to be seen. Like Trump is here. He's willing to listen. So Trump goes out on stage and the crowd is like very anti. They're like yelling stuff at him. And he's like, okay, well, don't vote for me then. And you can just keep getting your 3% that you've gotten in every other election that's ever been, where they don't do anything for your party. Or you could maybe try to do something different and work with me and we'll accomplish something together. And I was like, that is so smart. And he
Yeah.
just puts things in a perspective, just like he did. Candace Owens always talks about her wake up moment was when he was like, okay, to like the African Americans that he was like speaking to at that point. He was like, don't vote for me and nothing's going to change. You might as well like take a shot on me because the Democrats have done nothing for you for decades. And that was like her wake up moment. I think this could be the wake up moment for a lot of these libertarians that realize like, hey, Biden hasn't done anything. The Democrats haven't done anything. Why not vote for Trump?
Yeah, I agree. He's just going to have to be very presidential from like here on out and not
Yes.
not,
I
you
think
know,
he's
crazy
toned it
Trump.
down though, like I do. I think he's toned it down quite a bit, but you're always going to have the little craziness come out with him. But, we'll see. So lots of things going on, but we're not talking about that today, right?
No, but you led into it perfectly because, when you were talking about how Don Jr. is saying COVID was the distraction for 2020 and the distraction for this election could be World War III. So I want to go back to, I think it was a week and a half ago. Tucker did an interview with Jeffrey Sachs. And I don't know if you listened to this, Stephanie, but it was fucking amazing. And this guy, he's an American economist, a professor, a public policy analyst. He has a very interesting background with our government for over 40 years. This guy has like been part of a lot of behind the scenes shit that most people don't know about. He was the special advisor to the UN Secretary General from 2001 to 2018. He's currently president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's written books on ending poverty and globalization, and he's the co-editor of the World Happiness Report, which we actually talked about a couple months ago on the podcast when America dropped out of the top 10 for the first time. And so normally I would be like, oh, someone involved with the UN, like, no fucking thank you. But, Tucker always has really great interviews. So I was curious to hear what this guy had to say, especially since I saw in the title that they were talking about Ukraine. And holy shit, like I was blown away. This guy's explanation about why we're so balls deep in Ukraine just made everything like crystal clear to me. This was the light bulb moment that put everything together for me. And even though all the shit we've talked about on this podcast for the past 2 years has opened my eyes to how corrupt our government is, this was like next level with this interview. And so the interview is 2.5 hours long. It's a straight up history lesson for the first 35 minutes. And it's stuff I never learned in school. So I encourage everyone to go and listen to this episode if you haven't heard it. But if you don't have 2.5 hours to dedicate, I'm going to try to summarize and break this down in like less than 10 minutes. So at the beginning of the interview, Tucker brought up how, like, the Biden admin and the MSM just keep pushing this narrative that the war in Ukraine was unprovoked. It was an unprovoked attack by Russia. And he played all these clips of all, these government officials saying it over and over and over again. So he asked Sachs to explain, like, how did the war actually start and why? And Sachs basically said it has nothing to do with Ukraine at all, and it has everything to do with the power of the US military industrial complex and wanting to basically dominate and have direct influence over all of Europe and take power from Russia by placing American resources right up against the Russian border with NATO. Now, we already know that the US military industrial complex wants to dominate, but the way he put it together was like a wow for me. So he compared the US objective to the game Risk. Stephanie, did you ever play Risk when you were a kid?
No, that was the one game I never played, and I just had no desire to play it. And I think I know why now because I've always been against world domination.
Yeah, and it's like if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, it's a board game and you have like this political map of the world and it's divided into territories and the goal is like to capture territories from other players. And you can do this, you can create alliances or conflict or be like diplomatic or just like straight up conquest. And it's a strategy game for world domination. And so Sachs brought up, which also I did not know, how the fact that we're trying to isolate Russia isn't anything new because this is what the Brits tried to do back in the 1850s during the Crimean War when they were the world power before they, lost all their power after World War II. And now the United States has been trying the same play for the past like 30 to 40 years. And so if we look at NATO, like it was created by US, Canada, and a few Western European nations in 1949 after World War II. And the whole purpose was to give Europe an alliance of countries that would collectively serve as like a security measure against the Soviet Union. And originally there were 12 countries in NATO, but over time it's expanded. And now I think it's somewhere around 20 countries. But what I didn't realize was that at the end of the Cold War, President Reagan guaranteed Russia that NATO wouldn't expand, and then we went ahead and did it anyway. So I want to play this clip from Sachs because he explains a little bit of the timeline.
First round. And then Brzezinski, in a 1997 article in Foreign Affairs magazine, which is kind of the bellwether of foreign policy, wrote a strategy for Eurasia where he laid out exactly the timeline for this U.S. expansion of power. And he said late 1990s, we'll take in Central Europe, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. By the early 2000s, we'll take in the Baltic states. Now that's getting close to Russia. By 2005 to 2010, we'll invite Ukraine to become part of NATO. So this wasn't some flippant thing. This was a long-term plan, and it was based on a long-term geostrategy. Now the Russians are saying, are you kidding? We wanted peace. We ended the Cold War too. You didn't just defeat us. We said no more. We disbanded the Warsaw Pact. We wanted peace. We wanted cooperation. You call it victory. We just wanted to cooperate. I know that for a fact because I was there in those years. What Gorbachev wanted, what Yeltsin wanted. They didn't want war with the United States, nor were they saying we're defeated. They were saying we just want to cooperate. We want to stop the Cold War. We want to become part of a world economy. We want to be a normal economy. We want to be a normal society connected with you, connected with Europe, connected with Asia. And the U.S. said, we get it, we won, you do everything we say, and we determine how the pieces are going to go. So in the early 2000s, Putin comes in. First business for Putin was good cooperation with Europe. Yes. You go back to the early 2000s. Again, I know the people. I watched closely. I was a participant in some of it. Putin was completely pro-Europe. Yes. And pro-US, by the way. I know. And we don't want to talk about this. We don't want to admit it because we don't want anything other than unprovoked. So everything is phony, what we say. Everything is a lie. But just to say, the U.S. kept doing unilateral things that were really outrageous.
Okay. So then he goes into detail about how the whole reason we bombed Belgrade back in 1999 for like 2.5 months was because the United States wanted to break apart Serbia and create the new state of Kosovo. And I didn't know this was why, but he said it was so that we would have a place to establish the largest NATO military base in Southeast Europe. And this is all documented by the US government, by the way, like it's all recorded. So as predicted in what that guy wrote in the article, by 2004, 7 more countries were added to NATO, all the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Then in 2007, Putin gives this speech at the Munich Security Conference, and he's talking about, how the United States promised Russia back in 1990 that NATO would never enlarge. which is, again, recorded in US archives and like NATO documentation in multiple countries. But this was all conveniently forgotten, like the United States had amnesia. So Putin tells the US and NATO, like, don't think about making Ukraine part of NATO because they're directly on Russia's border and it's part of their integrated economy. And it wasn't just Putin saying this, apparently. Like leaders throughout Europe and especially Germany were telling the US the same thing. Like, Ukraine should not be part of NATO. This is a bad idea. Ukraine is like the do not cross red line. And I thought this was interesting because Sachs basically compared Russia's reaction to bringing Ukraine into NATO to like how the United States would feel if Mexico said, we're going to put some Chinese military bases on the border of the Rio Grande with Texas, right? Like, clearly, we would not be okay with that. I mean, the Biden admin probably would, but a president who is actually loyal to our country wouldn't. So the United States basically is like, fuck it, we're doing this, right? Despite objections from Russia and other European countries. And then the NATO summit in 2008 rolls around, and President Bush doubles down on this whole thing, even though at the summit, he's approached by multiple European leaders who are saying, like, no, this is a bad idea. This is reckless. And it seems like nobody except for the United States wants Ukraine to be part of NATO. But this is all part of like US foreign policy to become the world superpower. So we're like, no, Ukraine is going to be part of NATO. But since this was in 2008, there was no specific date or time frame given.
Well, and wasn't it in 2008 where Bush like basically told Putin like, oh yeah, we're not going to do that, don't worry, and they came to like an agreement one-on-one, and then he went away for like Christmas for a couple days, and then he came back and was like, yep, like we're bringing Ukraine into NATO. Like he totally went back on his word to Putin.
Yeah. Yeah. And here's what I found interesting is like Sachs explained that Ukraine didn't even want to be part of NATO at that time. And public opinion in Ukraine was totally against the idea of joining NATO. They just wanted to be neutral. And in 2010, the Ukrainian people elected Viktor Yanukovych as president, and he was in support of the country staying neutral. But because this wasn't part of the United States plan, now Yanukovych was seen as the enemy, right? And so, like we do whenever we want to overthrow a country's government for our own benefit, our CIA got involved and we were complicit in creating an insurrection and a coup at the end of 2013 to overthrow Yanukovych and get rid of him. So, when did the war in Ukraine actually start? According to Sachs, it was in 2014 when the United States created this regime change to force Ukraine away from the idea of neutrality and set them up to become part of NATO.
I would love to know how much regime change did the US cause under the Obama years? Because the countries are adding up. Like we've talked about this in other podcasts, and it's like this all happened. Well, a lot of it happened under Obama, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, and then, when Biden was elected, you had Kamala Harris, of all people, stand up on the world stage and invite Ukraine to join NATO, which it either has to be the dumbest thing you can do because it's like a punch in the face to Putin, or that was the whole point, was to instigate war. Like, why would we want to do that? And we know why, right? It's because the elites, including many of our politicians, are vested in military weapons companies. So an ongoing war means ongoing profit. And they had peace for 4 years under Trump. They lost a lot of money during that time, right? So they got to do something. So then you go and you get this guy, Zelensky. I don't know when he was put in place. I guess that would have been in under Obama. But the guy is literally a comedian and an actor. You can go right now and go search his name, and you will see videos of him dressing in drag, dancing to Beyonce on like these dance videos, to now all of a sudden he's like portraying himself as this tough leader of democracy, even though he's not holding elections because of war. And so it's kind of funny because it's like, who better to play the role of a puppet than an actor. Like they literally went and picked out an actor to put in place as the head of this country. Like how screwed up is that?
Yeah, and it's all part of the plan. And I'm going to play another clip because I want to go back to like all the shit we were doing to Russia. Like we basically fucked Russia for years, right? So listen to this.
That. So what came out of that was two agreements called the Minsk I and the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement was backed by the UN Security Council, and it said that we'll make peace based on autonomy of the Donbas region. Now, very interesting. The Russians were not saying that's ours, we want that, all the things that are claimed every day that Putin just wants to recreate. You know, he thinks he's Peter the Great. He wants to recreate the Russian Empire. He wants to grab territory. Nothing like that. The opposite. We don't want the territory. We actually just want autonomy based on an agreement reached with the Ukrainian government. So what was the U.S. attitude towards that? U.S. government attitude. U.S. government attitude was to say to the Ukrainians, don't worry about it. Come on, don't worry about it. You keep your central state. We don't want to see Ukraine weakened at all. We just want a NATO in a unified Ukraine. Don't go for decentralization. We tell them to blow off the very treaty that they've signed. Then we accuse Russia of not having diplomacy, by the way, which is, par for the course. Oh, you can't trust them. We blow off every single agreement. We blow off not moving 1 inch eastward. We blow off the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We have so many NATO-led wars of choice in between. I didn't even mention in Syria, CIA attempt to overthrow Assad, in Libya, and so forth. And we blow off the Minsk agreements. And actually, Angela Merkel explained in a rather shockingly frank interview that she gave last year, when asked why Germany didn't help to enforce the Minsk agreement, because Germany and France were the guarantors of the Minsk agreement under something called the Normandy process, she said, well, we just thought this was to give some time to the Ukrainians to build up their strength. In other words, they were guarantors of something in a phony way, and the U.S. was absolutely lying about this. And I know senior Ukrainians who were in government and who were around the government who said to me, Jeff, we're not going to do that. Anyway, that was at gunpoint. We don't have to agree with that. So all that diplomacy was blown off. The war continued. The U.S. pumped in arms, built up armaments, was building up what would be the biggest army of Europe, actually, a huge army that Russia was watching. What are you doing? You're not honoring Minsk. You're building up this huge Ukrainian army.
Paid for by NATO.
Paid for by the United States, basically, yes. And in 2021, Putin met with Biden. And then after the meeting, he put on the table a draft Russia-U.S. security agreement, put it on the table on December 15th, 2021. It's worth reading. Very plausible document. I don't agree with some of it. It's a negotiable document, something you would negotiate. I thought the core of it was stop the NATO enlargement. And I called the White House myself at that point and said, don't have a war over this.
Who did you talk to?
I talked to Jake Sullivan, and I said, don't have a war over this. We don't need NATO enlargement for U.S. security. In fact, it's counter to U.S. security. The U.S. should not be right up against the Russian border. That's how we trip ourselves into World War III.
Okay, and here we are, right? On the border of World War III. It was probably the absolute worst position that our country has ever been in when it comes to global politics. And we've basically created this situation ourselves while misleading the American public to believe that this attack on Ukraine was unprovoked, when in fact, there's a history of over 30 years of provocation towards Russia because the United States just does whatever the fuck it wants on the world stage. And the bottom line is like, despite what we are being told, this war in Ukraine has nothing to do with protecting Ukraine. It has nothing to do with democracy. It has everything to do with US domination. Like, we're not the peacekeepers. We have no moral high ground on this issue. Nothing we're doing is in the best interest of Americans or Ukrainians. We're basically being the bully, and we're essentially destroying the entire country of Ukraine for our political benefit. Like, we are complicit in killing over 500,000 Ukrainian people, destroying an entire generation of men, destroying our own economy in the process by spending over $175 billion on aid to Ukraine to continue to fight a losing war that we've given like no end in sight for the amount of money we're going to send. And now we're setting the stage for the possibility of nuclear war with Russia. And our government does not give a shit because they have basically doubled down on this agenda for control, which is only made like more clear by the fact that we have a president who refuses to even call or meet with Putin to discuss how to get out of this mess. And Sachs made it very clear that if Ukraine becomes part of NATO, we're risking legitimate nuclear conflict with Russia. And now keep in mind, Russia has just as many nuclear warheads as we do. And we have enough idiots in our government that they will continue to put this agenda before the safety and welfare of the American people. And so I have one more clip that I want to play, and that'll be the last clip that I play from this interview.
Apparently the game of risk. You need your piece on that board, as if American NATO forces in Ukraine is somehow existential for the United States as opposed to a neutral Ukraine. And they thought that they would get their way. And I spoke with senior officials all along who just thought Russia won't object or can't object or will be pushed aside or will fall to its knees with U.S. financial sanctions or will succumb to the U.S. HIMARS and ATACMS. Just one absolutely naive idea after another. But you might ask me, how can they have such naive ideas?
Well, that was my question.
And,
yes.
And I'm sorry to put words in your mouth, but I would say, well, I'm old enough to remember Vietnam. I'm old enough to remember trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. I'm old enough to remember Libya. I'm old enough to remember Afghanistan. We screw up nonstop. This is not clever, what we're doing.
But the people, what's so interesting, so you've been an academic your whole life. I think you're one of the youngest tenured professors at Harvard, but you've also been, I think uniquely, a diplomat, on and off, mostly on for, decades. So you know the people who are making U.S. foreign policy personally well. And the quality of the person engaged in that seems to have declined just dramatically.
I think that's true, by the way. I think it's true in general of American politics. Maybe it's an illusion, but when I was a kid in college, I did my summer internships in my senator's office, Senator Phil Hart. He was a man of great integrity, of great intelligence. He was a Democrat, but he had lots of Republican friends and colleagues. There were big people there, and they were serious people. Fulbright and Frank Church and really wonderful, impressive people. Chuck Percy.
I don't think that was the right clip. Anyway, my point is that we have put ourselves in this position where like, we're just going to keep fucking going because we're just too dumb to stop. Like, does this not open your eyes, Stephanie, to how next level corrupt the military industrial complex is?
No, it's super eye-opening, especially hearing from someone on the inside. It confirms, a lot of the things we've been talking about on this podcast. But I think the other thing is like, we've grown up with this idea that Putin is this like big bad guy that wants to like blow up our country with nukes or something. And really, we've been messing with this guy. Like, he's had a lot of patience, it sounds like, because we've been fucking with him for a long time. And it's interesting, like I remember when I was a kid and like after 9/11, all we heard about was terrorism, terrorists. And that was the first time I had ever heard about it. And I remember asking my mom, like, why do these terrorists like want to hurt us, And she knew how freaking fucked up we were. And she said, because we stick our nose in every other country's business and we get involved in things we have no business getting involved in. And we're like the bully. And so they all freaking hate us. And like, looking back, I'm like, how did she know that when like all she had was the nightly news? There was no social media, but she got it. And then about a year ago, I was on TikTok and there's this video of this girl who was talking to her grandpa, who's a veteran. And he said, honey, like, if only you knew what I know. And she's like, you always say that, grandpa. Like, what is it that you know? What do you know that I don't know? And he got so serious. And he's like, when I was overseas fighting, I realized we were the bad guys. America, we were the bad guys. We were the bullies. We were in places we shouldn't have been, killing people who didn't deserve it. And around that same time that I saw that video is when, all this stuff started popping up about evidence that like 9/11 wasn't what we were told it was. There was a lot to the story that, the public had no idea. And basically, like that became an excuse to then invade the Middle East, right? And what did that do? Well, it kept the US dollar as the oil currency and it kept us at the top of the food chain. So, like, piece by piece, I've kind of been putting this together for a while. Um, and it's funny because on this podcast, we're always talking about this like scary new world order, right? Like the one global power. And obviously, we point the finger at like the World Economic Forum, the UN, Bill Gates, and so on, which we should. They're evil. But what this interview made me realize is that there's already a one world order, and it's the US military industrial complex. And
Yeah.
it's not the government, it's not Congress or the Senate or even the president. It's the billionaires that own massive sectors of the world economy. They're the puppet masters. And like, I was listening to another podcast that Tucker did with Tim Dillon, and they made a really good point because they're like, do we really think that these billionaires that own like the world are just going to be pushed around by some congressman? Like, of course not. And it's like I always say, Congress is one big theatrical performance to make it look like we, the people, have some control when we really have no say at all. And, when the Pentagon is missing trillions of dollars and Congress people are retiring and making millions by sitting on the boards of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, then I think it shows like who's really in control. And it's not us. It's not the people. It's not the government. It's the military industrial complex. And Tim Dillon, he made a great point as well. He said, there's all these organizations that are really smart because they do these little things that really don't matter to like kind of like throw us a bone, like make us think that we have some sort of say over things. And so he used the example of like Chase Bank implementing some DEI agenda and hiring trans people. But at the end of the day, they're still going to foreclose on everyone's home and make a shit ton of money and then laugh at us for being so stupid as to think that like the shit that doesn't matter, like DEI was somehow some great like feat of the people. Like it's all a distraction tactic. And so that interview, I feel like it shows what's really happening behind the scenes while we are all distracted with DEI, racism, LGBTQIA, LMNOP, like those are all distractions. This is the real shit that's happening behind closed doors, and we have no control. And we're all too busy fighting with each other to see what's happening over here that this guy just laid out.
Yeah, and that Tim Dillon interview, I was surprised because that guy's like a comedian, and
Yeah.
his knowledge of what's going on in the political world was pretty damn insightful. Like that was a
Yep.
good interview. But I also want to point out that last week Biden authorized Kiev to launch U.S. supplied weapons at military targets in Russia. Now, we gave them like the tactical missile systems back in March, and none of this was really broadcast to the media. Like you can find it on more conservative news outlets, but the MSM wasn't talking about it. And so, why did we give Ukraine these kinds of weapons that they're not supposed to use? Because that's apparently what Biden said last week is like, you can go ahead and like fire certain weapons at military targets in Russia, but don't use the tactical missile systems. Well, like, obviously, they're going to be used at some point. Like, we are knowingly supplying Ukraine with weapons that Russia has outright warned us will lead to nuclear war. So after Biden does this, I think it was on Thursday. On Friday, Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Security Council of Russia, he gives out a warning that Russia is not bluffing when they say that they're going to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And they warned that this conflict could spill over into other countries, aka the start of World War III, right? So he publicly stated, quote, "This is, alas, neither intimidation nor bluffing. Russia regards all long-range weapons used by Ukraine as already being directly controlled by servicemen from NATO countries. This is no military assistance. This is participation in a war against us. And such actions could well become a casus belli, which is an act that provokes war. The current military conflict with the West is developing according to the worst possible scenario. There is a constant escalation when it comes to the firepower of NATO weapons being used. Therefore, nobody today can rule out the conflict's transition to its final stage," end quote. Now, I don't know about you, Stephanie, but my assumption that final stage means nuclear war. And then on Friday, same day, Zelensky says, oh, it's only a matter of time before Ukraine does use the long-range missiles provided by the US to strike Russian territory. And also, NATO military trainers are eventually going to be sent to Ukraine to start training 150,000 new recruits closer to the front lines for faster deployment. And so it's like, we just continue to push and push and provoke and provoke. And everything Sachs said was in line with Tucker's interview with Putin that he did a few months ago. And I remember just like that opened my eyes from hearing from Putin directly about basically confirming everything this guy said. And then I don't know if you ever watched that Netflix documentary, Stephanie, but it came out a couple months ago. I think it was called The Nuclear Bomb in the Cold War. And like I was surprised being on Netflix that there was some impartial things going on there, but it gave a very similar history. And we just continue to like get deeper and deeper in this political quicksand. And like, look at when we put sanctions on Russia. Like that was a complete fail. It didn't cripple their economy. All they did was form an alliance with China and other countries. Like their economy has not been hurt one bit. And meanwhile, we're literally hemorrhaging money. We're creating so much debt in our country that the dollar is being devalued. And nobody has come up with a viable recovery plan for our economy. And like Americans should be fucking pissed. Like you said something to this effect in the beginning of the podcast, but I feel like I've just been misled my entire life about America's role in global politics. And the narrative that I was taught has just been like deception for decades. And you know, I've said this before on the podcast. I didn't pay attention to politics really until the last few years. And even when I started educating myself, it wasn't until we started doing this podcast that I really began to like deep dive into this shit and try to understand the extent of our very sordid history. Like I always believed America was this great nation that truly was for freedom and democracy. And I thought our involvement in other countries was, you know, for the good of bringing freedom and democracy to oppressed nations. But then it turns out half the time we're the oppressors. We've started wars all over the world for the benefit of the military industrial complex, not the American people, not the people of these other countries. And I just feel like if we hadn't been experiencing all of this turmoil in our own country since the Biden admin came into office, I would still have my head in the sand. And like, so would a lot of other people that are opening their eyes to how actually corrupt our fucking country is.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of us still do. I think we still do to a certain degree. So let me ask you this. If we know that they're playing the game Risk with a big nuclear power like Russia, we have to assume the same shit is happening with Israel.
Yeah.
Right? Like we are hand in hand. It's one and the same. And just think about it. Like it started with Gaza, which had been wiped clear. I mean, it is gone. It is wiped clear for this new port that, mark my words, will end up becoming a canal that gives them control over all shipping from Asia to Europe, multi-billion dollars every year. And now what's happening, we can see they're moving on to Iran. We can see it already laid out. Like it's going to become a conflict with Iran. Almost my entire life, we have been in the Middle East fighting.
Yeah.
Obama bombed 8 countries for no reason whatsoever. 8 countries. And I think the guy that did the interview with Tucker actually did another interview at some time where he said someone came to him and they were like, yeah, we're going to bomb 8 countries in like a really short span of time. And he's like, why? They're like, we have no idea. Like this shit has been happening for a long time. We finally get out of Afghanistan, which what a mess that was under Biden. But it's only because Trump called it out and told the people the truth and how we had no business being there for 20 years. And I think that I even brought this up on the podcast back when like that all happened, when we withdrew from Afghanistan. I was like, we will be back in there by the time Biden's term is over. And sure enough, we're finding our way right back into war in the Middle East because it's all about control. And like, think about it for a second. If they're kind of in cahoots with Ukraine, right? This whole backstory, and they went ahead and let 500,000 Ukrainians die. If our own government took out a sitting president, JFK, which, you know, we now know with all these declassified docs, and now they're trying to jail the leading political candidate, do you really think that the US or Israel gives a fuck about 1,000 Israelis dying on October 7th? Like, really? Do you really think that they care? No, these people are fucking evil. It was simply an excuse for them to then wipe out Gaza, make billions of dollars on that area, get a stronger hold on oil and gas in the Middle East. And I'm going to venture to say that this is all coming together as a stark warning to BRICS. So we know they're instigating all this shit with Russia, which is part of BRICS. Now Iran. It's like they're trying to tell them, like, we are the superpower and you better not move off the US dollar for gas. I mark my words, like I guarantee this is a stark warning. Like you don't fuck with us. You may think we're weak, but we will annihilate your entire country. And I know that that's going to piss a lot of people off that listen to this podcast. I know that. But ask yourself, like, how can we say that the military industrial complex has done all of these horrific things all over the world for decades and decades and decades, but that things are all of a sudden different in this scenario with Israel and Gaza? It's not. Trust me, it's a power play. It's a game of Risk. These paragliders just happen to not only cross the border, but stay there long enough to massacre like everyone there brutally before the best intelligence agency in the world knew about it and one of the strongest militaries came to the rescue. Like, just think about it for a second, you know? And knowing everything we know after this episode, I cannot believe that that's just an accident. I can't say there's this like big bad military industrial complex, but it's only bad when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, and not assume that the same for every other conflict we've ever been in. And especially when now we can see clear motives for them going to war in Gaza and in the Middle East. And when people start questioning it, what do? They bring out these idiot protesters at universities that say and do stupid shit and act anti-Semitic so that we all get pissed off and stay on board with Israel. I think these protests are not at all to help the people of Gaza. I think they're purposely obnoxious to get people so turned off that we keep applauding Israel while simultaneously seeing children's heads being blown off on social media in Gaza. Like it's a game of fucking 5D chess. These people are evil. This military industrial complex, they don't give a shit about you or I or Israelis. or Ukrainians. They will wipe us all out if it means more profit for them. And what means more profit for them? Ongoing war. And why would they want to get in a war with Iran? Because Iran is part of BRICS, and they're threatening, they've been publicly threatening with Russia to take the US dollar away from oil, which would cripple the United States. So I feel like we are sending them a message like, you fuck with us, we take out your president, we will annihilate your entire country with bombs and make $1 billion off of it. Like, that's how fucked up I think this is.
Yeah, and you just made me think of one other thing that Sachs was talking about in that podcast. You know how we have like military bases all over the world?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it was him or Tucker. It might have been Tucker. And they were saying like, from the standpoint, like this enables the US to basically have major political influence in terms of pulling the strings with the political parties in all of these countries. And that essentially like they're not free actors. And I think it was Tucker, he said like it's like comparing it to if men with guns show up at your house and they like camp out in your house, like you're not the head of your household anymore, right? And so it's a great analogy because if you look at this and then you look at, you know, Israel and Gaza and you look at where all of our military bases are, they're around the whole fucking world.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can get like it is a fucking domination game. Like no matter whether you're looking at the Middle East, whether you're looking at Eastern Europe, like it doesn't matter. It's all about the US military industrial complex. And
yeah,
it's just so much bigger than I ever thought it was.
So the silver lining of all of this, I think, is that I think we're safe in the United States because no one is going to dare fuck with the United States in a nuclear war. Like, I really think everything we're seeing with like, oh, China's building up their ships and we're not, and and this and that. I think it's all a theatrical performance. The Pentagon, we have trillions of dollars missing. You think that's just missing? No, they probably have shit we can't even fathom. And the whole world know, all these world leaders know it, but they tell the people, oh, we have to fear Russia and we have to fear China because they're going to nuke us and it's going to be World War III. So we stay afraid. So that way we back up our military doing all this crazy shit all over the world, when really they have a foothold everywhere. They control everything. They are everywhere you could possibly be. They have every weapon you can possibly think of because it's not our government. Once again, it's the fucking companies that make the weapons. Like, that's who's in charge. And so the silver lining is, do I think that we're going to be like it makes me look at everything different. Like, do we really have to fear China and Russia? Probably not. They probably have to fear us. And I think, again, I'm telling you, this whole thing with Israel is sending a message to BRICS. Like, you better not fuck around with the US dollar, because throughout history, Saddam Hussein, every single person that tried to remove the US dollar from oil, they took out and they destroyed their entire country. And I think they're reminding them of that right now, which means I think here, the dollar's probably going to be safe. We're probably going to be safe. Meanwhile, they're wreaking havoc around the world. That's what my epiphany was from this episode.
Well, this is all recorded, so we can go back to it.
Oh my gosh.
If and when this happens.
I feel like this was just like
yeah.
It wasn't a light bulb. This was like a nuclear bomb reacting in my brain. Like, oh my gosh, it's all been a lie. The corruption's so much bigger than we realize.
Yeah, it's insane.
Oh, well,
Happy Monday.
What a thing to wake up to on Monday, right? That'll give you some things to think about on your car ride to work or home. All right. Well, happy Monday, everyone. And I don't know what we're going to have for you Wednesday, but I don't know that we're going to be able to top this. We'll see. But thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you back here in a couple days.